With the Witcher adaptation coming soon to Netflix, I thought it might be helpful for those completely unfamiliar with or only vaguely familiar with the story to get some information about it. Before we jump into it, I think it's helpful to also let you guys know what the premise of Witcher is for those of you who truly are really unaware of the story, but you're intrigued and interested in watching the show. So a Witcher is somebody who has gone through genetic mutations to enhance them and make them more capable to fight the monsters that are in their world. And often these people, these witchers, are considered monsters themselves. They're considered villainous. A lot of people think the mutations have stripped away their ability to have emotions, and they also often really don't care for them, given the fact that witchers make money off of saving people. Our main character, Geralt of Rivia, is one of these witchers, but the story isn't necessarily just about him traipsing about killing monsters. You do see monsters featured on occasion in the story, but most of the story actually is about Geralt's life and how it is intertwined with a sorceress named Yennefer and a young princess named Ciri. That's a pretty basic and vague setup for this story. I'm going to be getting into some other general information about Witcher that I think is really helpful to know before watching the Netflix adaptation. If you yourself are a really big Witcher fan and I leave out anything that you think I should have mentioned, feel free to leave your helpful information in the comments down below. Getting into it, the first bit of information is that the adaptation is based on the books, not the video games. This is a pretty significant distinction to make, as many Witcher fans were introduced to the story through the games and occasionally will have opinions or expectations for what the show should be, despite the games not being considered canon. The games are actually a what-if scenario, and while I highly recommend The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt video game because it's amazing, it's not what the show is based on. The thing that's good to know is that it ties in with the fact that it's based off of the books, and that is that the books came first. They came before the video games. Sometimes I still have people surprised when they find this out, and I've seen it enough times that I thought it'd be helpful and nice to point it out, because not everybody is familiar with fantasy, not everybody's familiar with Witcher, and even though I always assume that people know this, I do find that a lot of times people are still pretty surprised. I actually think there are a couple of reasons that make this assumption very reasonable. One is that a lot of the world has come into Witcher through the video games, and on top of that, a lot of the books that are published end up having video game art as their covers, which kind of leads people to think that the books are almost like a fan fiction of the games themselves, when in actuality the books came first and the video games are adaptations of them. Not only were the books released before the video games, but also the events in the books take place before the events in the video game. So instead of having a direct adaptation where the games are taking events from the books and just putting them on the screen and allowing you to play through them, you're actually getting, like I said earlier, a what if scenario for what if our characters did these things after the events of the books, which is why it's so important to know the first point, because your expectations for what is going to be in the show might change when you realize all of this information, that the books came first, the show is based off the books, and the events in the books happened before the events in the game. Beyond all that, while I personally am always really excited for any kind of an adaptation, I know that some people don't think as highly of video game adaptations as they do of book adaptations. I think a lot of us are very aware that both have received their fair share of bad adaptations, but generally a lot of people associate bad adaptations with video games. And so while I'm always willing to give them a shot, I think for those people who are on the fence, not really sure if they're interested in the show, maybe knowing that it's based off of a book series and that the book series came first might tweak their perspective. The next helpful bit of information to know is The Witcher's roots, as the story was originally written in Polish and by a Polish author. This is a pretty important thing to note, as a lot of the tension that you might have seen surrounding the Witcher adaptation, I think, is in part due to the fact that we have Netflix adapting something that is very significant to a lot of people in Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, though, that's not to say that if you aren't of Central or Eastern European descent that you can't enjoy this story. There are plenty of themes throughout The Witcher that transcend one's country, but knowing that The Witcher is so important to a certain group of people might shed some light on why there seems to be so much controversy surrounding the show. There are some people that were expecting the adaptation to represent their values and their culture because that's what they feel is represented in the books themselves. And based off of what we've seen of the trailer, the news that's come out, the pictures that have been released, based on those things, some people's expectations for what they thought they would be seeing in the show aren't necessarily what they're actually seeing. If you're somebody who is completely unfamiliar with Witcher, or you haven't seen too much about all of this controversy, you just know it's there. I think it's very easy as an outsider looking at the situation to think it's one of those kind of, to put it bluntly, white people only want to see white people in a fantasy adaptation. Sadly, that is true for some individuals, but it's certainly not true for everybody who is less than optimistic about the show. There are some people who were just expecting to see their culture represented, and thus far, they're not sure if that is what the show is going to be. This is always a very difficult thing to bring up, as you have people who are passionate on both sides, and often people who are very extreme on both ends of the conversation, but there are a lot of people in the middle who are willing to have good, healthy conversations about this topic. If you are somebody who wants to avoid all of that and you just want to enjoy a fantasy TV show, then definitely don't look at comments sections or look at articles addressing this. But if you are somebody who wants more information on this specific point, I do have an entire video dedicated to it. It's honestly pretty enlightening to look in the comment section of that video, as the range of emotions, outrage, and intelligence is pretty astounding. Moving on to the next thing that I think is important to know, which is that the Witcher novels start with a collection of short stories. Actually starts with 2 collections of short stories. Based on how some of the Witcher books are numbered, it can actually be kind of confusing to know which books to read first, but The Last Wish and then Sword of Destiny are the first 2 books in the series, and they are the collections of short stories. Because of this format, the stories happen to take place over several years, and they don't always occur in chronological order. The Last Wish specifically goes back and forth between past and present, which is pretty common, especially in a lot of TV shows. It's pretty common to see flashbacks, but in The Last Wish, the past's timeline isn't necessarily cohesive to the rest of the times that we go into the past. In simpler terms, the past is usually just one of Geralt's memories, and then the next time you go into the past, it's a different memory. This is pretty relevant to the show because what we've been told so far is that the events in the first season of the adaptation are going to be pulled directly from these first 2 books. This means that no matter how good or bad the show is, the usual book fan complaint of that's not how it happened in the books is likely to come about in excess. I think in some ways it might seem like the short stories would make for good episodes of a TV show, but again, because they take place over years, it doesn't really lend itself to an adaptation that well. So I think most people are aware that they're gonna have to omit some things, and then they're gonna have to add some other things to make this work. An example of this would be the age of one of our main characters, Ciri. In the books, at the beginning, Ciri's not even born yet, and by the end of the series, she happens to be a young adult, and because the show is starting off where she is already going to be an important character, this is where you're going to start to see some changes having to be made. The last little bit of general information that I think is helpful to know is that the Witcher story is very dark. I know that you guys are mostly going to be adults that are watching the show, or if you're not, you're likely mature enough to watch this and you can handle yourselves, but I always think it's courteous to let people know if something's going to be a little bit darker. Not everybody is really comfortable with that kind of material, and on top of that, I wanted to say why I think the darker tones in this story, they don't feel like they're meant to shock us, they definitely feel pertinent to this story. The significance of how dark the story is, I think, is very much in part because of the setting. The setting in the Witcher story is a world that has been ravaged by war, and it's so often occurring that it has kind of created a sense of numbness in the people of this world. In the 5th book of the Witcher series, called Baptism of Fire, we do see some of our characters traveling through villages that were raped and pillaged by armies. As you can imagine, our characters see the horrific ramifications of war. They see bodies that are half eaten. They see bodies that have clearly been tortured. They see naked bodies of women who were very clearly raped before they were killed. Coming across innocents who are still alive often isn't much better, as the characters are then exposed to people going about these horrific acts. At the beginning of the video, I gave a very vague synopsis of this story. It's a monster hunter named Geralt. It's about his life with a sorceress and a little girl princess. I gave this kind of almost adventurous sounding premise, which it kind of just sounds that way on its own. It's not untrue. That is the setup for the story, but it's not necessarily this fun, campy adventure. So if that's kind of what you were expecting from Witcher, it's really not what you're going to get. It is very dark. It does explore some awful things that human beings are capable of, and if anything, the tagline that the show is pushing a lot of, the worst monsters are the ones we create, I think that's a pretty good tagline to give you an indication of what this story is going to be. Anyway, that's it for some of the things I think are good to know before getting into the Witcher adaptation. For those of you that are very familiar with the story, I know a lot of this was probably very old news to you, but if you're brand new to Witcher, let me know if any of this, if you would like me to get into more of it, to expand on it, or if you have any questions in general that I didn't address, I'd be happy to answer those. I also have an entire playlist dedicated to Witcher here on my channel, so if you are interested in learning more about it, I'll have that linked. But anyway, I hope you found this helpful. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.